Today's video is going to cover Chapter 22, Token Economies. Now, a token economy is a reinforcement system where we're going to set up conditioned reinforcers, known as tokens, that we can give to people when they exhibit desirable behaviors, and then they can redeem or exchange those tokens at a later time in order to receive another kind of reinforcer. So we're going to go through all of those components step by step and break it down, and then also look at some of the examples of token economies, how they're useful, how they are often used, and sort of some of the things that we need to keep in mind if we were to set one up ourselves. So let's start off with the most basic of steps here, and that's figuring out what a token is. So a token is an object or symbol that is exchanged for goods or services. That's a generic definition of a token. But when we're talking about psychology and specifically a token economy, we want a token to also be an object that can be accumulated, something that an individual can build up a collection of. We want the token itself to have no phylogenetic value, basically meaning that there is no biological value. So a poor token would be a food or a drink, something that has a use that's related to our biology. So if we're picking good tokens, we want something with no biological value to it. A token should then be something that you can exchange for a phylogenetically significant stimulus. So this is where our what are called backup reinforcers come in. So once you've earned enough tokens, the idea behind a token economy is that you can exchange those tokens that you've earned for something that is biologically relevant. So these backup reinforcers are things that are say food or drink or fun or something enjoyable, something that itself would be reinforcing. But the tokens are just something that's going to get us to later on getting these backup reinforcers. When choosing tokens, it's usually a good idea to use something tangible, something that you can physically touch or interact with. So having something like a coin or a poker chip or a marble, something that you can touch, tends to help. You can also have something like tally marks on a checklist or something like that that can act as a token as well. It just doesn't qualify as tangible, which is sometimes fine. So tangibility is something that we often see but isn't a requirement. And it doesn't state it here, but it is also good to note that because these tokens are used to get those backup reinforcers, because they're being paired with physical reinforcers, our tokens will become a conditioned reinforcer. And so those are going to be strengthened as they're redeemed for those backup reinforcers. So over time, our tokens come to have their own reinforcing value because of their association with those phylogenetically significant stimuli, or our biologically relevant backup reinforcers. So before we spend too much time talking about what a token economy is and how we can set them up and how we can make use of them, let's take a little bit of a detour and start early on in the history of these token economies and look at a little bit of a proof of concept. So we're going to look at two basic studies, one done by Wolf, one done by Cowles in 1936 and 37 respectively, but they were looking at the effectiveness of token systems or economies. If we want to match, I guess, the title for the chapter, Token Economies, we wanted to see if they can be used in any kind of setup. So these two were done using chimpanzees. And these two studies paved the way for what we commonly see nowadays with our token economies. So the first of these, the Wolf study, had chimps that were trained to lift a bar system to receive either tokens or food. Some individuals were trained to do this behavior in order to receive tokens that they could exchange for food, or they could be trained to do the behavior to receive food directly. And over time, they increased the response requirement in order to receive their reinforcer, whether that reinforcer was tokens or food. And they found that despite the fact that one was a primary reinforcer and one was a conditioned reinforcer, the responding was effectively maintained for both types. So even as they increased that response requirement, meaning that they had to lift the bar system more and more times, they found that the behavior was maintained for both those who were reinforced with tokens and reinforced with food. So tokens could serve as a reinforcer in these situations. Okay, so what next? As I mentioned, the Cowell study also used chimpanzees, and in this case, they were given a discrimination task. In reality, if you sort of read through the abstract for this article, they did quite a few different discrimination tasks. They did a bunch of different experiments and tests, but we're just going to hit some high points here. So if the chimpanzees were given the discrimination between white tokens, which were associated with food, and brass tokens, which were associated with no food, where if they sort of reached for the correct ones, if they reached for the white tokens, they could receive food, or they could just receive white tokens that they could then later exchange for food. We found that whether they were reinforced right away with food, or whether they were reinforced with those white tokens that they could then exchange for food, if they made that correct discrimination by choosing those white tokens, both groups could learn to discriminate between the good white tokens that got them food, either immediately or eventually, and the bad brass tokens that got them no food, again, either immediately or eventually. So they found that they learned the task fairly rapidly. There was faster learning if they got the food right away, as opposed to if they got a token, which they could later exchange for food, but they did still see learning even when just a token was used. So this is giving us more evidence saying that, yeah, tokens can serve as reinforcers for situations like this. Now, we've already actually mentioned a couple of reasons why it might be a good idea to use something like a token. Though at the time we weren't calling them tokens, we were calling them just conditioned reinforcers. Something like a clicker, or giving someone praise whenever they do the right thing, where you're letting them know that they've done the right task and that they will be receiving reinforcement just later on. So if you kind of connect those topics, you can start seeing why tokens are actually an effective reinforcer in a lot of situations. So I'm going to take just a moment here to talk about a couple of things that are not explicitly stated in the textbook, but do apply to tokens. So our tokens can be brought under discriminative or stimulus control. So like we just saw in our chimpanzee example, they can learn that certain tokens will get them food and other tokens will not. So those white tokens are associated with food and therefore should be chosen when given the opportunity. The brass tokens are not associated with food, so maybe you don't want those, so you don't choose them. And so continuing out from that, tokens can be differentially reinforced. Some tokens can be reinforced with food, some cannot. You can also start introducing things like activities or something that isn't quite as immediately biologically relevant like food or water. But the ability to play a video game can also be reinforcing. So you could reinforce an exchange of a particular type of token for playing video games or something like that. If we are treating tokens as conditioned stimuli, then it makes sense that the value, the reinforcing value of those tokens, could be extinguished. if this token is no longer exchangeable for food, then it isn't worth anything anymore. So if every time you try and exchange a token that used to get you food and now it doesn't, then that token is losing value. It can go through extinction. In specific conditions, the accumulation of tokens can act itself as a discriminative stimulus. So the more tokens that you've earned, the closer you are to exchanging them for the reinforcer that you have earned. And that accumulated token collection can function as an antecedent stimulus that generates increasing responding. So as you're getting closer and closer to being able to redeem your tokens for the thing that you want, then you're going to respond more vigorously because you're getting so close to getting that reinforcer. And of course, this will depend on the schedules that are being used for delivery of those tokens and all those other fun features we're going to talk about later in this lecture, but there is a situation where that can happen. And just like I had mentioned with our conditioned stimuli being able to bridge gaps, letting someone know that they will receive a reinforcer in the future, tokens can be used to bridge long delays. So if you're training your dog and they won't get a treat until later on, you could use something similar to a token to let them know that they made the right response and they will get a treat later. I also want to take a moment here to pause and talk about generalized reinforcers, or more specifically, generalized conditioned reinforcers. So these are conditional or conditioned reinforcers that are contingent upon multiple forms of unconditioned reinforcement. Basically, this is something that can come from multiple sources. So if you think of money or praise, you can get money from doing a lot of different tasks. So you can have a job as a waiter or waitress, and you earn money there. You can also get money from birthday cards. You can earn money from participating in research programs. There are so many different ways that you can earn money. So it counts as a generalized reinforcer because there isn't just one way of obtaining money as a reinforcer. Same thing with praise. You can be praised for doing all sorts of things. You can get praise if you do really well at a track and field meet, or if you score really high on a test, or if you clean the kitchen. All of these would get you praise. So there isn't just one form of praise or one way that you can do it. It comes from multiple different varied sources. So those are two options or two examples of generalized reinforcers. Now, the fact that you can receive these reinforcers from multiple sources makes those reinforcers less dependent on effects of deprivation and satiation, meaning that they're not as subjective to our establishing and abolishing operations. And that's because there isn't any one establishing or abolishing operation that targets all aspects of those reinforcers. The problem here is that there hasn't been a ton of laboratory research that really picks apart how these generalized conditioned reinforcers are different than regular conditioned reinforcers. So money is very similar to what we're going to talk about with our token economies, but it's not identical, and there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. Now, these unknowns listed here are only a couple of the big questions in this field of research. We could spend an entire course talking about generalized reinforcers and all of the different research that's been done and will soon be done about them. But some of the questions they have are, what types of experiences are necessary for their formation? So how do we form a generalized reinforcer? How do we form an idea or a concept of what money is versus a more specific token? Are these generalized reinforcers more resistant to extinction? Are they preferred over specific reinforcers or not? Is losing a generalized reinforcer more punishing than losing a specific reinforcer? So if you lost money, is that more or less punishing than if you lost a more specific reinforcer, like one of the tokens we're going to talk about later on? And will subjects work harder to obtain a generalized reinforcer over a specific one? And as I said, we don't really have any hard answers to these questions. And what that usually means is that some research will say that, yes, generalized reinforcers are stronger, better, more resilient than specific reinforcers. And then other research will say the exact opposite. So right now the field is a little bit vague and uncertain, but I'm sure that as more research is done and as more time goes on, we'll have a better idea of how these generalized reinforcers fit into our concept for tokens and token economies. But it's just a little bit of a detour so that we can talk about sort of special cases and not quite tokens, and how they kind of relate but don't really for our token economies. Okay, so on that roundabout waffle, we can get back into our token economies. So let's talk about a couple of examples. And the textbook does a great job walking through a bunch of practical examples in lots and lots of detail. So if you're still feeling a little bit fuzzy on what specifically a token economy is after you've gotten through this lecture, I would highly recommend taking the time and reading through one or more of the many, many examples in the text. But just very briefly, some examples of token economies would be poker chips given to students for correct answers in a special education classroom. So if the students answer a question correctly, they might be given a poker chip. And then at the end of the day, they could redeem those poker chips for, I don't know, early recess, or maybe they get chocolate or something like that. So they can redeem those poker chips, those tokens that they earned during the day for something that they would enjoy. Another example would be canteen money given to psychiatric hospital patients for appropriate social behavior on the ward. So if these patients are seen to exhibit good behaviors, they would be given money that they can redeem at the canteen in that building. So once they've earned up enough canteen money, they can take their money to that location and exchange it for whatever the canteen sells. Maybe it's snacks, maybe it's special drinks, whatever it is, they can redeem their money there. Next example is marbles stacked in plastic tubes in the nurse's office, delivered for self-help skills exhibited by individuals with intellectual disabilities in a group home setting. So this time, instead of having the individuals hold on to their tokens, these marbles would be placed into plastic tubes in a central location. So whenever they exhibit those self-help skills that they're trying to develop, someone would put a marble into those plastic tubes, show them that they're earning marbles, and whenever they've built up enough marbles, they could exchange them for something, some reinforcer. And then our last example would be holes punched into a card for pro-social behaviors each day, carried by juveniles in a correctional program. So these individuals would hold on to cards, and whenever they do a good behavior, then someone would come and give them a hole punch, and if they earn enough punches to their card, then they can redeem those for certain benefits. All right, so hopefully by now you're starting to see some of the key points in a token economy. And if you're not quite getting there yet, that's all right, because we're going to break down the essential features of a token economy. So there are 6 features that we're going to focus on, and we're going to talk about them one at a time. So step 1 is that we need to identify and define our target behaviors. So what is the desirable behavior that you want to increase? If we're looking at our examples here, so the first one is that we want the students to correctly answer questions. So that is our target behavior that we're trying to increase. Here we have appropriate social behavior is what we're trying to increase. Self-help skills and pro-social behaviors. Those are all the skills that they're identifying and defining so that they can start setting up this token economy. You might also in this stage start identifying undesirable behaviors that you want to decrease. So maybe you're not just increasing good behaviors, maybe you want to decrease bad behaviors. As we will see, in certain situations where you want to decrease bad behaviors, you might actually set up a system so that you would take away or deduct tokens if people exhibit those bad behaviors. And of course, having a good operational definition is important here because you want to not just identify, but define the target behaviors. So what makes up a correct answer seems pretty straightforward. What about social behavior? What specific social behaviors are they looking for? They should have a list of what counts as a good social behavior. Self-help skills, again, they should have a list of all of the skills that qualify and what those look like so that the individuals who are running this token economy know when they should be handing out their tokens. Step 2 is to identify the items that you're going to use as tokens. As some of our key features here, a token should be easy to deliver and easy to accumulate. This means that it should be something that is quick and easy for the person running the token economy to hand out, and it should be something that the individuals who are trying to earn these tokens can accumulate. Something down here, so we have stickers. Stickers might be a good item to use as a token because it's fairly easy for our change agent, the one running the token economy, to keep a bunch of stickers with them and hand out stickers whenever they see the desired behavior. And it's easy enough for our clients to accumulate stickers. Maybe they just keep them on their shirt or on a piece of paper or something like that. Something like a point card, like you'd have at, say, Starbucks, where you can carry that card with you, and every time you swipe your card, you get points. That counts as a token economy because you are earning points for doing something that the company has deemed good by buying things. For these tokens to be effective, they must not be available outside of the token economy. This means that you can't get these tokens anywhere else. So if you're giving out stickers, you want to make sure that they are not easily available stickers, that the kids can't just go to the local dollar store and pick up a pack of 100 stickers and those could be used instead. You want to make sure it's hard to counterfeit, that it's hard to cheat these, and that you can only get them by doing the behavior that's being targeted by this token economy. Step 3 is for us to identify and procure our terminal or backup reinforcers. So these backup reinforcers must be known reinforcers that we know work for those participants. It would be a good idea to get a feel for what the participants enjoy doing. What do they like to eat? What do they like to do in their free time? And because they're redeeming their tokens for access to these backup or terminal reinforcers, it's probably a good idea to have a variety of them available. Not only so that each individual has some options to choose from, but so that not everybody is stuck with the exact same selection. For example, you wouldn't want the only thing to choose from to be, say, sugary snacks. And maybe if somebody doesn't enjoy sugary snacks, then those backup reinforcers aren't actually reinforcers for them. So you should include other things. So maybe you include salty snacks or drinks or something untangible that doesn't quite fit into food and water. Maybe you want to use something like give them access to music. free time, access to gym equipment, let them play video games. Any of those things can serve as backup reinforcers. So these could be physical, social, or others, things like privileges or services. Though we do want to keep in mind that you can't restrict access to anything that would be unethical to withhold access to. So, for example, you can have things like extra snacks and desserts as prizes or as reinforcers that can be earned, but you can't withhold access to all food to try and motivate them because everyone deserves access to food. So you have to make sure that the things that we can redeem our tokens for are things that go above and beyond our individual needs. All right, so once you've decided on your behaviors and the tokens you're going to use, and your backup reinforcers that the tokens can be redeemed to, or the tokens can be turned in to earn, we should then decide on a schedule of reinforcement for the delivery of the tokens. Basically, we're asking, what is our token production schedule? How many tokens can the participants earn for each target behavior? So if you're trying to get a child to put away his laundry, then are you going to give him 1 token every time he puts away his laundry? Are you going to give him 1 token for each sock he puts away? Does he have to do the whole thing to get a token? What quantities are we using, and how often is it occurring? In general, what you usually see is that smaller tasks, smaller behaviors, or easier behaviors tend to earn fewer tokens, and things that are harder or more complex or more difficult or whatever, those will earn you more tokens. But you need to establish specifically what behaviors are going to earn you how many tokens and how often that's going to occur. Usually, early on, you want to have a pretty consistent and a pretty frequent delivery of tokens. Sometimes even a continuous schedule of reinforcement where every time you see the behavior, they earn a token. But over time, you might want to start adjusting this so that it's less and less frequent. You might move on to a partial reinforcement schedule where every other time they do it, they get a token, or every 4th time, or every 10th time. So you can adjust this schedule of reinforcement as time goes on. Closely related to that, for number 5, you need to also decide on the token exchange rate. So what is your token exchange schedule? So how many tokens are you required to obtain a particular reinforcer? So if you have a collection of our backup reinforcers, those things that you can earn, how many tokens do you need to redeem in order to get that reinforcer? So if you have the option of trading tokens in for a can of pop, or a bag of chips, or an hour of TV, how many tokens are each of those worth? And you need to find a nice balance between how easy it is to earn tokens, how much they want those reinforcers, and how expensive or how many tokens it's going to take to get each of those reinforcers. And so sometimes once you get started with the token economy, you might have to make some adjustments to actually find the right balance. You don't want it too easy to accumulate tokens, but you also don't want it too hard to get enough of them in order to afford our different reinforcers. So here's just some examples of tasks that can be completed, and in this case, their tokens are points. So these are how many points you can earn for each of these tasks, and this is what the reinforcers are worth. So if we wanted to look at this example here, if you want to watch a film, you need 50 points. So you can look at all of these different tasks, and maybe you want to prepare sandwiches. You want to make a bunch of sandwiches. So if you do that, then you have 60 points, which means you have enough points to redeem to watch a movie by yourself or something like that. So this is just one example of one particular token economy. All right, and then our last point, number 6, for our essential features of a token economy is to determine the time and place for exchanging your tokens. So this is part of sort of exchanging your tokens to receive those backup reinforcers. So what's our exchange production schedule? So you want to determine when the tokens can be exchanged for those terminal reinforcers. When can somebody take the tokens that they have and trade them for those reinforcers that they want to have earned? So sometimes you'll see a token store. So like in our example where they have that canteen money, where they could earn money that they could then spend at that canteen, they would have to go during the hours that the canteen is open. In some other places, maybe if you're in some kind of facility where there are supervisors around 24/7, whenever you have earned enough points, you might be able to go up to a supervisor and trade those in for your reinforcer at any time. But we need to establish the rules for when and where you can exchange your tokens for that terminal reinforcer. This next slide here shows an example of somebody sort of picking at their own token economy. So this individual set up a system actually for themselves to try and have a good balanced diet so that they would eat healthy and exercise more. And so they started off with their first point system where if they ate a light balanced breakfast, they got 1 point. They ate a light balanced lunch, 1 point. Supper, 1 point. If they didn't have more than 2 light snacks, they got 1 point. If they exercised, they got 1 point. And their goal at the end was that when they hit 35 points, they could buy an art poster. So for this individual, buying a poster for their wall was a really good reinforcer. So they kept track of their points, but they noticed after a little while of using this system that they were failing a lot of the time. So they were snacking too much on the weekends. So what they did was added an extra item. So if on Saturday and Sunday, so if on the weekend they had no more than 2 light snacks, they could earn 1 extra point. So kind of in addition to this one here, they could earn sort of an extra point on the weekends. So they made it more appealing to stop eating a lot on the weekends. Their next big insight was that what they tended to do was do really good with breakfast and lunch and maybe dinner, and then they'd give up on the rest of it and they'd pig out and have a bunch of snacks or whatever. So they decided to, again, make it more appealing, and they said if they had a perfect day, if they got 1 point for each of these, then they would get a bonus 3 points. So they could get extra points above and beyond what they could have earned on their own if they did every single item on this list. So this is showing what I had kind of mentioned earlier, where once you've established a token economy, it can be a fairly fluid setup, where sometimes you find that certain things work and other things don't. Maybe the balance is off, maybe there's a loophole, maybe you're finding that something's being exploited. So over time you can make these adjustments, make these refinements in order to find a system that works well. Our next thing to consider would be to introduce a response cost or negative punishment. And we kind of already hinted at this in step 1 of setting up one of these token economies, where I mentioned that we might want to identify negative behaviors or bad behaviors that we want to try and reduce. So we don't always introduce a response cost. Sometimes you're okay with just increasing the occurrence of good behaviors, and that's fine. But if you do want to start trying to reduce the occurrence of bad behaviors, then you're going to want to go through these steps as well. So, of course, you start off by defining those undesirable behaviors that compete with your desirable behaviors. So, if you're trying to exercise more, then maybe an undesirable behavior would be sitting still for too long or not going out or something like that. So, you could identify behaviors that are competing with the thing that you want to do. And then once you've identified those bad behaviors, you want to decide how many tokens you would lose for each of those bad behaviors. And again, there has to be a balance between how many tokens you can earn and how easy it is to earn those tokens and what they can be redeemed for. So you want to make sure that the loss isn't too extreme, but you also want to make sure that it's something that is bad. You want to have it be a response cost where it's a lot easier to just avoid doing the bad behavior because you don't want to lose those tokens. It is also probably a good idea to mention that introducing this response cost aspect should only really happen once the token economy has been set up. Losing a token isn't really something to do with response cost. It isn't really negative punishment unless those tokens have value. And that doesn't come until they've been conditioned, until they act as conditioned reinforcers. So this response cost aspect should only happen once the economy has been set up and the participants realize that these tokens have value, that they can be exchanged for those terminal reinforcers. So once you've established that these tokens have value, that you can earn them in that particular way, then you introduce this response cost aspect where you can start losing tokens for bad behavior. A couple of just quick tips to keep in mind for response cost procedures. You usually want to avoid punishing non-occurrence of a behavior. It's really hard to punish you didn't do this thing. It's a lot easier to punish this thing happened, this bad thing has occurred, therefore you lose tokens. But if you're being punished for not having a behavior, it's a little bit more vague. So here it says the non-occurrence of a behavior is not actually a behavior and therefore is not something specific that could be punished. So you do a lot better and you see a lot more effective outcomes if you can punish a specific behavior that you want to try and decrease. In this instance, you're a lot better off just reinforcing the occurrence of the behavior, and then the non-occurrence of that behavior will happen less often, if that makes sense. As we already said, you should be punishing undesirable behaviors that compete with desirable behaviors. So if you're trying to get somebody to do more of something, you might want to try and directly target so that they will do less of something that interferes with their ability to do the thing you're trying to get them to do more of. In order to be effective, the tokens need to actually be conditioned reinforcers. So as I said at the very beginning of this slide, you need to already have established the fact that the tokens are conditioned reinforcers. So you want to make sure that the token economy is functioning and that they have assigned value to these tokens before you introduce the response cost aspect. And to wrap up here, some other considerations to keep in mind if you're going to be doing a token economy. Some of these might be fairly obvious, but you want to try and prevent token theft or counterfeiting. Like I said, you don't want to get stickers that the students can go out and just make other stickers or buy a bunch of them from the dollar store or something like that. You want to make sure that they are unique and special and that they can only be obtained by doing the behavior that's set out in this token economy setup. So you want to prevent theft and counterfeiting. For the theft side of things, sometimes you're going to not be able to give the tokens directly to the participants. If participants are prone to taking the tokens from others, then maybe you use something more central and less manipulable. You could use a tally board. Maybe you have a big blackboard that only the change agents can write on because only they have the markers, and you can add check marks for each token that's earned or something like that. We might already have mentioned this, but it's a good idea to present tokens immediately after that desirable behavior occurs. And similarly, remove tokens immediately after undesirable behavior occurs. So, as we've talked about previously in this course, the closer the punishment or reinforcement occurs after the behavior has occurs, the more easy it is to associate them together. So if you can do these immediately, if the consequences follow immediately upon those actions, it's a lot easier to form an association there, and then you see learning quite a bit more quickly. And quicker learning means that you're going to see a shift in behavior quite a bit more quickly as well. It's also a great idea to pair token delivery with descriptive praise. Tell them what they did right. Give them like good job, a pat on the back, whatever, when you're giving them their token. This also incorporates natural forms of reinforcement. So once you're trying to shift away from using a token economy, if the token economy is working in, say, a group home or a hospital or a jail or something like that, if the long-term goal is to have that individual transfer back into society where token economies aren't very common, you might want to get them to rely on more natural forms of reinforcement, like being told that they did a good job and feeling proud of their accomplishments. And this brings us into the over the long term point here, where eventually you're going to want to discontinue that token economy using gradual fading. And because you want to get people away from this artificial token economy and focusing on more natural forms of reinforcement, things that they might be able to find in their natural environment outside of the facility where the token economy is being used. So you want to gradually schedule token delivery more and more intermittently. So you might want to move from a continuous reinforcement schedule to something that's more partial reinforcement, maybe every second time, and then every fourth time, and then every 10th time, until more and more it's not the token delivery itself that's reinforcing, but maybe the praise that comes with doing the good job, or internal feelings of satisfaction, or something like that. And of course, following all of these instructions and keeping to the rules that are established by this token economy can only happen if the staff, if those change agents who are running the token economy are well trained, are well managed, and if they stick to the rules consistently, then you're going to have much, much better outcomes here.